Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm your host John, and today we're going to be taking a first look at the WhiteBox Cyclopedia by James M. Spahn. And we'll get to that straight after the intro. Okay, so a quick disclaimer. WhiteBox Cyclopedia is going to be arriving on Kickstarter in the near future. As a fan of James' previous work, including but not limited to White Star and the Hero's Journey, I posted on social media about my intent to back it once it went live. And I was delighted when James reached out to me and offered to let me have a look at a pre-layout draft for a first look episode. No other payments has been received related to this, and it's very much a first look since I'm viewing a pre-layout version, which may differ from the final version published via Kickstarter. James was also kind enough to allow me to show some of the interior sketches and some of the mock-ups that he's done, which you can see in the background of this video. So first of all, in the document I'm looking at, we come to the foreword, which is written by Matt Finch of Swords and Wizardry fame. And in it, he talks about the development of Swords and Wizardry White Box, a great game, which I have a copy of just here, like it very much, and how it developed out of a desire to provide something for people who wanted to play something like the original version of OD&D without all the later supplementary material. White Box is a great simple game. I've got a copy with the Peter Mullen cover. There it is, look, absolutely great stuff. Peter Mullen illustrated the cover of many old school essential books I have. I'm a very big fan of his work, and it shows three adventurers trudging through a snowy landscape, oblivious to the danger posed by a couple of rock dropping ogres observing them from a ridge. We then go on to the introduction, and the first line of James's introduction sums up the essence of D&D to me. 6 attributes, 1 20-sided dice, and a fistful of 6-sided dice. All it takes to create infinite adventures. Whilst there's certainly something to be said for increased complexity and more options, a theme we'll probably return to later, personally I'm very much a fan of simpler rule systems that provide enough grit to adjudicate challenges and perils, but then they just get the hell out of the way the rest of the time and allow my players and myself just to focus on enjoying ourselves in the game. My experiences recently running Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition and also the, in my opinion, more streamlined 2nd edition have taught me that whilst there are more options in the 4th edition, those options are baked in as part of the core rules, leading to an increased amount of book flipping during sessions, something which I generally try to avoid, to be honest. I love options, but I also like it when they can be safely removed or ignored without wrecking the rest of the game, or requiring me to rework whole parts of the system. Chapter 1 in the book is Concepts and Attributes, and it begins by laying out the fundamental concepts of the game for those who may not be familiar with it. However, in what I consider to be a wise move given D&D's current popularity, it doesn't dwell on it over much. We get a breakdown of ability scores and modifiers, concepts which will be familiar to anyone who knows one of the very basics about D&D, but it's here we start to see a number of optional sidebars, and that's everything from experience bonuses for modifiers to alternate stat rolling methods that can be either included or omitted from your game of White Box as suits the needs of the GM and their group. Many of these sidebars contain house rules and options that will be more than familiar to people who've played D&D for some time. For example, the max hit points at first level rule is one I've used in numerous games just to give the PCs a small increase in survivability out of the gate. It's nice to see these house rules, though, presented in this optional sidebar format as something that can be taken or left alone depending on the needs of your game, and having such common house rules all in one place will make this a great reference book, in my opinion, to quickly look things up during play. Chapter 2 deals with the race of the characters, labelled as heritage in the White Box Cyclopedia, and it contains the standard dwarves, elves, etc. that we're all familiar with. I know some people get a bit hot under the collar about such terms being changed, but to be honest, I can't say it bothers me overly much. Each heritage has certain level restrictions on the classes they can take. For instance, dwarves can be level 6 fighters, level 4 assassins, level 4 thieves, level 6 tomb robbers, and level 4 wanderers. I believe this was done in the older versions of D&D to balance out the additional heritage abilities that non-humans receive, and it's a workable system. I know some players, particularly of the more recent versions, may chafe at level restrictions, but they're spelled out from the start and are used to keep humans, presumed to be the dominant species, competitive. An interesting element is that sidebars are offered for additional heritage abilities that the referee, which is how the gem's referred to in WhiteBox Cyclopedia, could add to each race in their game. I'd be interested to know if these swap out for the default abilities or, as the title suggests, are added on. I doubt any of them would make the various heritages too overpowered, to be honest, particularly given the lack of focus on balance in traditional OD&D, but it's an interesting thing to think about if you're going to allow these optional abilities. There are also a number of optional heritages ranging from the Deep One-esque Daganites to gnomes and various different offshoot heritages such as river halflings and shadow elves. Their inclusion is interesting, and I could see subbing them for the more default races to give your fantasy world a particular flavour or to place a particular spin on your world's lore. We're also told there are heritages as class options later in the book, where for instance a person would play a dwarf as both their heritage and the class, which has been the default in some versions of D&D, although it does seem to have fallen out of favour a bit recently. Chapter 3 begins with laying out the classes available in the game, starting with the classic cleric, fighter and magic user that were present in the original OD&D game, and again all of them come with numerous sidebars of additional and house rules. A nod to the more modern versions of D&D would seem to be that the classes use attack bonuses rather than THAC0, and I would assume that therefore ascending armour class, where higher armour numbers are better, will be used in the game, or at least be an option. To be honest, although it differs from the older versions of D&D, I vastly prefer this method of making attacks by rolling a d20, adding whatever various modifiers there are, and trying to beat your opponent's armour class, since it's always felt more intuitive to me, with higher numbers just being better. Each of the classes listed goes up to 10, in keeping with the rules published in the Swords and Wizardry White Box, and although other versions of D&D don't go much higher than this, I think 10 levels is more than enough time to have whole worlds of adventure in, especially given the typically more deadly nature of old school games. Most people I speak to about D&D focus on when they played at low to mid level. It seems to be relatively few games that reach the pinnacle of higher level limits, so I think focusing on just 10 levels is more than acceptable. I'd like to point out an optional rule I particularly love here, which is the rules for wizards crafting magical pipes that allow them to memorise additional spells. It's a great addition in my opinion, and it reminds me of the Dolmenwood pipe smoking optional rules, really conjuring up that vision of a Gandalf-like wizard poring over tomes of arcane lore whilst chuffing away on a pipe. Some of the optional classes like Assassin, Barbarian and Bard will be familiar to players of D&D, and it's a nice inclusion for any referee who wants to bring them into their games. There are also interesting classes that remind me of the old AD&D playbooks, such as Cavalier, chivalrous knights in armour, Druids, worshippers of the old ways, Errant Fool, a Quixote-like romantic hero, Friar, wandering holy men and women, Jesters, who are social misfits and acrobats, Metaphysicians, who are explorers of arcane science, and much, much more. Whilst I probably wouldn't advise using all of these classes in every campaign world, I like their inclusion as a useful reference and also allowing the referee and players to theme their game world by the choice of classes that is available. And we round off with some interesting heritage as classes. Chapter 4 is Equipments, Personnel and Accolades, and it lists costs and traits for all the various adventuring gear that can be purchased, and in my opinion takes the wise decision not to dwell overly much on them, since equipment chapters are never the most exciting in a book, although they are a necessity. The list of armour confirms my earlier suspicion that AAC, Ascending Armour Class, is used in WhiteBox Cyclopedia, a decision that I'm very happy with personally. We get prices for hirelings who aid the PCs on their adventures, and also for assistants who don't go on adventures but provide special knowledge and abilities that can be useful to a party. We also get some guidelines on building strongholds and earning a knighthood, and I've got to admit that such things seldom come up in games of D&D that I've run, often due to the rules seeming more trouble than they're worth. However, the rules in WhiteBox Cyclopedia are fairly easy to understand, with the hero spending 50,000 gold pieces and 4d6 months to build their stronghold, and then they get certain benefits associated with it depending on what type of stronghold they've built. For example, a PC building a keep gains the title of Lord or Lady. They get the service of 2d6 times 10 soldiers to protect it in the surrounding 3-mile area, and each season the ruler of the keep gets a tithe of 2d6 times 100 gold pieces. Knighthood must be granted by an NPC in a suitable position of authority after the hero has carried out a great and noble deed, and essentially comes down to a d20 roll modified by a number of factors. The final result becomes the character's accolade rating, determining their initial status and what equipment they are provided with. It allows the knight to spend XP to buy various additional abilities. These rules would add a little complexity, but not much to be honest, and in a game where the focus was chivalry, I think they could really add a lot of depth to the game without too much rules bloat. Chapter 5 is titled Playing the Game, and it covers the basic rules such as movement, combat, XP and the like. It'll be familiar fare to anyone who's played earlier iterations of D&D, but I think that's only to be expected. After all, this book is designed to be used as a reference for quick checking and the like during a game, in a similar manner to how Osric is a reference to AD&D-esque editions of the game. I think it really shines in this regard, presenting the rules in a clear and easy manner without any unnecessary frills or distractions. We do, however, get lots more of those lovely optional sidebars containing some rules OSRers will be familiar with, sundering shields and stuff like that, and some others that I've not seen implemented before, but I'm often asked about when players who are more familiar with other, more modern games get involved with old school gaming. The main rule I'm thinking of in this regard is the detailed miscellaneous actions sidebar, which gives you all manner of additional actions rather than just move and attack, such as assist, charge, dodge, parry, tumble, etc., which again could add more of a tactical element to a combat if that's what you're looking for, and it doesn't add too much complexity. We get rules for exploring wilderness hex maps, getting lost, foraging and seafaring rules, along with some small encounter tables, and a nice example of play to show how some of the preceding rules could be implemented during a game situation. In Chapter 6 we're looking at magic, which is in the traditional Vancian style, much beloved of D&D fans. For those not familiar, essentially arcane spellcasters study in the evening and pre-select spells, the number being determined by their level, and they store them in their mind. Once these spells are used, they are gone until the mage can study again. Clerics do similar but spend their time in prayer rather than in study. We get lists of spells for the various magic using classes, along with descriptions, and I'm pleased to see that the chapter eschews the tendency of some later editions to over-describe spells and to try and account for every possible situation in which they might be used. Instead, WhiteBox Cyclopedia gives us a spell level, range, duration, and a 2 or 3 line description of the effect, trusting the referee to adjudicate any edge cases that might arise. Near the end of the chapter, we have some interesting additional options, including latent spellcasters and blessed scions, essentially members of non-spellcasting classes who have the natural ability to cast a few spells, although far less than a dedicated caster. I think this has a lot of potential, depending on how closely the referee controls the spells available, to model all manner of slightly supernatural bloodlines and the like. My first thought was that it could be an excellent way of representing the dragon-marked houses in the Eberron campaign setting, something I've always fancied having a crack at running using an old-school set of rules. These extra abilities are balanced by the latent spellcaster having to pay an increased amount of XP to level up, which seems a sensible and no-nonsense way of handling it. The chapter rounds off with some cool little rules for magic jewels and psionics. I doubt I'd get a lot of use out of these, since I think they suit a very specific flavour of game and not the sort of game I tend to run. But their inclusion is a great touch, offering numerous options for referees and their groups to really make the game their own. Chapter 7 is running the game, and I'm always interested to see how RPGs handle chapters like this in a book, since the referee's advice section has always struck me as a difficult one to write. As someone who's made a number of GM advice videos, it's often difficult to pitch your advice right so that it's accessible to newcomers, but also not so basic that it puts off more seasoned grognards. James lays out his principles of being a referee, and it boils down to games should be fun, player creativity is more important than a character sheet, the referee is not a novelist, actions have consequences but so does an action, and the world won't wait for the player characters. And I'm a big fan of an author laying out their stall and their principles in books like this, because it gives you an insight in the author's mindset and how they're expecting you to play the game. Now, of course, you're free to discard that entirely and do whatever you want. It's one of the real joys of RPGs. You do you. But it's nice, in my opinion, to have that starting block. This section is short, at less than a dozen pages, and please keep in mind I'm looking at an art and layout free draft, so this number may change in the final product. but it doesn't outstay its welcome. The advice offered is good, although it doesn't delve too much into detail, although as a reference book I wouldn't really expect it to. There are again some great optional rules provided for flavouring a campaign towards particular subgenres of fantasy, which I very much appreciated, and we get some rules for carousing for XP, which is always a particular favourite of mine, particularly in open table games. Chapter 8 is the bestiary, and let's face it, every RPG needs a bestiary, a collection of monsters that can bedevil the PCs, dog their progress, and that worthy and lucky heroes can triumph over. In the style of the original White Box and other older versions of D&D, the stat blocks for monsters are pretty small, consisting of their armour class, hit dice, attack bonus, number of attacks plus damage, special abilities, saving throw, move, and how much XP they're worth. In addition, there's a small paragraph of descriptive text. This allows a lot of monsters to fit on each page, and I vastly prefer it to some of the more bloated stat blocks and pages of descriptions that are present in some other RPGs, particularly for monsters that are well known by RPGers and fantasy genre fans, like orcs and goblins, for instance. There's a real smorgasbord of monsters in here, from the very common to some that are a bit less expected. I was particularly pleased and surprised to see there are 3 types of vampire: the vampire, the bride, and the vampire lord in the book, since they've always been a personal favourite of mine ever since those heady World of Darkness days of the 90s. We also get some optional variants and rules, extending the usefulness of the monster stat presented. Next we move on to Chapter 9, Treasure. And this is the last chapter of the book, or certainly the document that I have, and it deals, as you might expect from the title, with treasure, but how to scatter it throughout your adventures and campaign world, and also descriptions of precious and magical items. There are small tables for determining everything from the effects of poisons, magical weapons and armour, down to wands and rings, all with concise descriptions of their effects. It's a great little chapter which, whilst offering nothing too surprising, will be a great reference for any old school referee seeking an appropriate prize to stash away at the heart of a deadly dungeon or cavern complex. So, now we've had a quick look through it, let's move on to my final thoughts. So, as I said earlier, I'm looking at a pre-layout and art-free draft. But saying that, I'm already pretty impressed with the writing and the content of this book. It's not exactly a surprise, since I'm a fan of James' writing style and his previous works, as I said earlier. The real strength of this book for me is that it's going to serve as a useful reference tome. You're not meant to sit and curl up by a fire and read through it with some music in the background, although you certainly can. Like I said earlier, you do you. It's meant to be used during a game, and the writing reflects that. There is a refreshing brevity and directness about the information that is being presented in the book. It's not overly flowery or dripping in purple prose. All stuff which, whilst it can be fun to read, often, as I'm finding with a couple of games I'm running at the moment, it can get in the way of locating information quickly during a game. What I want in a reference book is clearly presented information that I can access with minimum delays and fuss when I invariably forget some obscure rule during a game. For someone who has memory problems like myself, this book will be a real boon when running White Box. And even if you don't have seizure-induced memory conditions like my good self, but you've got any interest in White Box or old school gaming, I would advise backing this when it hits Kickstarter, and depending on when you're watching this, and I'll put a link down below to the Kickstarter page. Or if you're watching this after the Kickstarter has finished, pick it up. I would advise picking up a copy from whatever retailers it's available on. I assume it'll be available on drive-through in PDF, and when it comes out, I will put the links in the description for this video. The book strikes a great balance between providing a consistent reference point for white box gaming, but also adds increased value with the number of optional rules and ideas that are included. The fact that these are optional and are kept separate gives the referee the power to pick and choose what suits their game. But it means that should you choose to tweak the rules in your game, you won't necessarily have to start entirely from scratch. Overall, I highly recommend the book and will be certainly backing it myself when the Kickstarter campaign begins. So there we are. That's my first look at a pre-layout and art-free draft of WhiteBox Cyclopedia by James Spahn. As I say, I highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to the Kickstarter coming out. I think it's going to be a great book. And thank you very much, James, for letting me have a look at this early draft and agreeing that I could share some of the lovely internal artwork and the cover mock-up. Thank you very much for that. So that's it for this video. Until I see you next time, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun. I'll see you soon.